So welcome. First of all, thanks for being here. I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for what I'm hoping will be a really interesting discussion today on proliferation financing in Southern and Eastern Africa. So for those of you who have not engaged with the Royal United Services Institute before, let me just take a minute to introduce ourselves. So RUSI is a defense and security research institution. We were established in 1831, which someone can correct me on this, but I think that makes us the oldest defense and security think tank in the world. My name's Darya Dolzikova. I am a research analyst on our proliferation nuclear policy team here at RUSI. And I work primarily on counter-proliferation finance, which is a program that we've had running since 2015. And our CPF work consists of a combination of both research and implementation work. So we might be familiar with a few of you through a lot of that work already. And the CPF project sits on the intersection of our Center for Financial Crime and Security, as well as the Proliferation Nuclear Policy team. So it draws expertise from both those teams. So we've kind of made ourselves a team that brings together the best of both worlds, I think. So once again, thanks for joining us today. The event today is a little bit of a launch, I guess, a launch event for a paper that we had done, that we had published a couple of weeks ago now, called the Southern Stratagem, and it focuses on North Korean proliferation financing in Southern and Eastern Africa for the most part. And what I'm hoping we can do today is I'll take a couple of minutes to just sort of go over the top highlights of the paper, the top conclusions of the paper, and then from there, I'll turn it to our very distinguished panel of experts here who have experience in financial crime and organized crime and sanctions evasion, across the Southern and Eastern Africa region, both from the public and private sector perspectives. So I'll turn to them, and hopefully we can have a little bit more of a discussion on PF trends in the region more broadly, outside of just what we addressed in the paper. So I should start out by saying that the paper, for those of you who have not read it perhaps, as I said, covers proliferation financing, North Korean PF specifically, in Southern and Eastern Africa. We did not try to be a comprehensive guide to all things PF in Southern and Eastern Africa. We started with an assessment of the typologies and the trends and the cases that we found in the panel of experts reports, and then kind of build out from there. So we didn't try to be comprehensive. Hopefully we caught a lot of the patterns, but hopefully we can flesh a few more of them out today during the webinar. So before I go any further, before I launch into the discussion of the paper, just wanted to flag a couple of things. I just wanted to stress that the webinar is on the record today, and it is also being recorded, so just keep that in mind. You can type any questions that you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, of the Zoom box there, and then those questions will populate into the question feed, and we'll pick from those once we open up to the discussion. And when you submit a question, we do ask that you please provide your name and your affiliation as well, so that way we have a little bit of context for who's actually asking the question. And we'll pull those once we get to the Q&A session, or the Q&A part of this webinar. So let me launch right in. I'm not sure how many people on this webinar have actually had a chance to read through the paper. It is quite a long document. So I'll go over some of the top trends or some of the highlights of the paper, which will help hopefully contextualize our conversation a little bit today. So what we did, Anagha, Joshi, my co-author, and I, what we have done is we conducted sort of a high-level regional risk assessment for Southern and Eastern Africa, and we based the methodology for that off of the RUSI PF National Risk Assessment Methodology, which Anagha, myself, and Emil Dahl from the CFCS team developed last year, and that's all available online on our webpage as well if it's of interest. And so yeah, so we use that methodology very, very roughly, again, because this is not a national PF risk assessment. That would take a lot more time. So basically what we did is we identified PF threats in the region, we identified PF vulnerabilities and PF consequences, and took a look at how those interact to create PF risk in the region. So in terms of threats, We looked at threats across 3 different categories, and anyone who's worked with RUSI on CPF before will be familiar with these. So we looked first and foremost at PF threats originating from trade in proliferation sensitive goods. So this relates to payments, transactions, financial services that relate directly to the financing and trade of proliferation sensitive materials, so goods that feed into a WMD program, in this case, the North Korean one. We looked at threats in the region within that area. These types of PF threats we found were not, at least in open source literature, as prevalent in the region as in some other regions, because a lot of times we see these threats coming from regions with very sort of broadly developed, highly developed high-tech, IT sectors. However, this threat is not unheard of in Southern and Eastern Africa, so we couldn't dismiss it altogether. There are dual-use industries in the region, as well as some existing nuclear infrastructure and historical experience with nuclear weapons in the region, which I hope we will dive into a little bit more in the Q&A. So we did look at a couple of threats within that category. However, the largest category of PF threats that we found, again, the most prevalent ones, the ones that were available in open source data that we had gone through, and that category is revenue raising activities. So these are activities that proliferators, in this case North Korea, engage in to raise funds for their proliferation activities. And this can be a combination of both inherently illicit activities, so things like wildlife smuggling, or in the case of North Korea, what we see sometimes, what we see in Southern and Eastern Africa quite a bit, is the use of what would be otherwise legal activities. So things like construction, the construction of monuments, military sales, for instance, which in and of itself is not an illegal activity. But because they're carried out for North Korea or on behalf of North Korea, they become illicit in the sense that they come under UN sanctions. So in the region, when it comes to revenue raising activities for proliferation purposes, for PF purposes, we looked at a couple of things. So military cooperation, there's a history of military cooperation between North Korea and quite a few Southern and Eastern African countries. And when I say military cooperation, that includes the sale of weapons systems, but also weapons components, refurbishment of weapons systems, the provision of spare parts, as I mentioned, the construction of weapons production facilities as well, or training as well of personnel, security, military personnel. So it kind of runs the full spectrum. We looked also at the construction of statues and monuments, which I mentioned earlier. That's quite a large revenue raising activity, or has been, in Southern and Eastern Africa for North Korea. Wildlife smuggling as well, it's a typology that we found when it comes to raising funds for North Korea in the region. The deployment of overseas labor, which is an interesting one because that's come under sanctions. It came under sanctions in 2017, but there was a repatriation deadline at the end of 2019. The paper doesn't really delve into kind of the first half of 2020. Most of our research kind of ran up against that expatriation deadline at the end of 2019. But it's interesting to see that there has been quite a bit of North Korean labor that has historically been in the region. So it sort of raises questions about how much of that labor has remained, under what conditions, under what circumstances. And then we took a look at cybercrime as well and the abuse of cryptocurrencies. Not as prevalent of a threat in the region, but because we see North Korea increasingly using these typologies to raise funds, we felt we'd be remiss if we didn't address it at least somewhat. And then the last category of PF threats are the threats that come from the financial and corporate networks that support the two activities that have been established in the region. So we've seen cases of North Korean bank accounts, North Korean front and shell companies throughout the region that support the first two categories of activities, so the financing of proliferation sensitive goods and revenue raising activities. Now, the extent to which these PF threats are actually allowed to materialize a lot of times, in large part, is determined by the existence or lack thereof of PF vulnerabilities in a region. So are there measures that mitigate against these threats, or are there measures that perhaps exacerbate these threats? So in a PF risk assessment, you would look at the interaction between the two to figure out what the risk profile is. So in the region, we looked at a number of PF vulnerabilities across a number of categories. we found quite a few. So we looked at, for instance, geographic and environmental vulnerabilities in the region. So we found things like porous borders across the region, the presence of trade and transport hubs, which again exacerbates challenges when it comes to tracking the flow of goods, whether illicit or not, and the flow of people, and making sure that the activity that is going on cross-border is not actually in violation of sanctions. It is not PF activity. Porous borders and the presence of large transport and trade hubs complicates that a bit. The presence of mineral deposits in the region. Now, North Korea is a pretty mineral-rich country itself. So what we would expect to see normally, or where the vulnerability would come from most likely, is the exploitation or the provision of services. So mining services or mining technology by North Korea to the region. So that's a vulnerability, a potential vulnerability that we identified, and there have been some sort of suspicious cases where we think that that may be the case. We looked at economic vulnerabilities, so the presence of constrained budgets in a lot of these countries means that they might turn towards cheaper North Korean goods, or might be more reticent to apply proper measures to make sure that sanctions are not being violated, because they want to bring in investment, they want to bring in trade, and they sometimes perhaps might see that as a trade-off, which it's not, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, but you could see how a country might make that calculation. In terms of technological vulnerabilities, things like weak cybersecurity practices in a lot of these countries, the growing use of cryptocurrencies in parts of the region, and then again, the presence of dual use and proliferation sensitive goods, as well as latent and more current nuclear infrastructure, specifically in South Africa. And again, I'm hoping we can dive into a lot of this in more detail in our Q&A, because we have folks who are quite familiar with a lot of these aspects. Social and political vulnerabilities would include things like existing relationships or past relationships between North Korea and a lot of the countries in the region. There are quite a few historic legacies of relationships between the two, between the country, North Korea, and the region, and that in and of itself is not a sanctions violation. Countries are welcome to maintain diplomatic relationships with North Korea, but it does sort of raise questions on how much do you open yourself up to vulnerabilities at that point, that North Korea might exploit that relationship. And as part and parcel of that is the presence of North Korean diplomats and embassies in the region. There are quite a few, and North Korean diplomats have been known to operate in the region, as they have elsewhere, in support of North Korean sanctions evasion and PF activities. And then last but not least, we looked at legal and institutional and operational capabilities. So this may be of particular interest to a few of you, particularly those who, again, look at all these things in a lot more detail. So anyone kind of coming from an FIU might be particularly interested in looking at these, because we looked at regulatory gaps, legislative gaps, implementation gaps, when it comes to international PF or rather CPF obligations. And what we found is there are gaps in legislative frameworks in the region that relate to the implementation of targeted financial sanctions and other CPF obligations. So the legislation or the regulation a lot of times just isn't there, or it's not sufficient. We looked at transparency in countries when it comes to ultimate beneficial ownership, legal persons, legal arrangements. That tends to be weak in a lot of countries. So a lot of times corporate registries are opaque or just not publicly available. So compliance departments and banks, for instance, can't really do their due diligence as well as perhaps they'd like to. We found some weaknesses in regulatory authorities for monitoring and for enforcing CPF compliance. So even where legislation perhaps exists, actually enforcing it can be a challenge. Also a few operational challenges. So for instance, the absence of national PF risk assessments. This is not unique to Southern Eastern Africa or Africa as a whole. There's only a handful of countries who have done a national PF risk assessment, but the absence of one does make it a little bit harder to address PF risk. And then challenges in conducting financial investigations in some of these countries. and then also some challenges when it comes to institutional cooperation, so within a country between different agencies, and international cooperation as well, so across borders. So across all these vulnerabilities, what we try to do once we detailed them is to provide some recommendations on how could governments particularly, but in some instances financial institutions as well, address these gaps to strengthen their CPF regimes. So I've highlighted a lot of vulnerabilities and a lot of challenges. That is not to say that the outlook is bad or everything's bad. There actually has been a lot of good progress made in the region, and a lot of efforts are being put in to strengthen CPF regimes in the region, and to strengthen compliance with CPF regimes as well. And we have highlighted those best practices throughout the paper as well and given examples. But what I will do now, actually, this is a good transition, is I will hand over to the experts that are on our panel, because they represent really the trove of expertise that exists across the region when it comes to proliferation financing and the efforts that are going into countering it. So like I said, we're very lucky to have a few of them here with us. So I will turn to the panel and allow them to make some opening remarks and prepared remarks kind of on their own areas of expertise. And then after that, we'll open up to a little bit of a discussion. I'll ask them some questions, we'll have a conversation. In the meantime, please feel free to keep sending in questions into the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll pick from those, and hopefully we can get a good discussion going between the audience and the panelists as well. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel. So we have here with us Chris McAdam, who joins us from South Africa. He is the head of the Priority Crimes Litigation Unit at the National Prosecuting Authority of South Africa. He brings with him a wealth of experience and expertise on South Africa's counter-proliferation and CPF efforts. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from him and about his experience. We also have Lloyd Meadows, who's calling in from Dubai, and he is the Sanctions Advisory Director for the Middle East and Africa at Standard Chartered Bank, at the Financial Crime Compliance team there. And he'll be able to provide us with a bit of a private sector perspective on CPF challenges. CPF is always a two-way street. It's always has to be a conversation between governments and the private sector. So we're very lucky to have Lloyd here. For full transparency, Lloyd had kindly agreed to be one of the peer reviewers on the paper. So he's read it, he's commented on it, he knows it quite well. Doesn't necessarily mean he agrees with all of it. So it'll be interesting to have him as part of the discussion as well. And then last but not least, we had Malukan on the line, but it looks like we just lost him. I think the connection was not great there for us. So we just lost him. So he won't be joining us, but hopefully he'll be able to send in some questions and some comments in the Q&A, so that we can have his input as well. I should also mention, we were meant to have Leonie Dunn, who is the head of the Namibian FIC, with us. Unfortunately, she was also unable to make it, but I think we have a great panel nevertheless, and I'm looking forward to a very interesting discussion. So without further ado, I will turn it to Chris.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion. Just briefly, I head a unit in the National Prosecuting Authority, which is responsible for guiding investigations and prosecutions into all matters relating to proliferation, violation of Security Council resolutions, and other state security matters. So over the years, we've had extensive experience in dealing with proliferation networks. We've had incidents involving transshipments involving North Korea, and we've also been able to work very closely with our financial institutions and then also our shipping industry when it comes to the actual acquisition of hardware. If we have some more time, because I think I was told I've got 5 minutes, I'll briefly talk about seeing proliferation involving North Korea in terms of two categories. The first is the acquisition of the prohibited materials, either WMD, military commodities, or other items that are denied to the country. There it moves you into export control. And the first obligation is obviously to have proper non-proliferation control legislation. In our country, we are the member of a number of international regimes requiring us to then have domestic legislation that puts the relevant commodities under import-export control. We then say that is not sufficient to have an effective regime. We must, in addition, have inspectors who police the industry, who will check that they're not illicit transactions between the legitimate flow of commodities. And then we need specialized investigators and prosecutors to deal with the cases where violations are detected. And lastly, we have a dedicated FIU component where we have analysts dedicated specifically to working on proliferation cases. So that is our machinery to try and prevent countries such as North Korea being able to source materials from us. We haven't had any instances of that having taken place. We have 2 instances of military items being shipped from China to the DRC, and then the ship anchoring in a port in South Africa, and then we interdicted the ship and confiscated military materials, because in terms of our legal framework, even if a ship is moving through our waters without offloading cargo, a transit permit is necessary. And so in those cases, the commodities were confiscated because the necessary permits were lacking. We learned a lot from those cases. One of the important messages, where you deal with an import or export involving the country, you'll be able to get a full set of shipping documentation. With a transshipment, you will only get very limited material available. So your opportunity to investigate is less with a transshipment than with an import or export. If we talk to our financial sector, our banks are required by law to screen against the full consolidated UN listing. They have special components within the banks that deal with the issue of enhanced due diligence, special risk factors that they have to take into account. Where our banks use US correspondent banks or trade in dollars, in terms of US Treasury regulations, they're required to, in addition, screen against the OFAC listings. And the last issue that I thought we'd talk about is the issue of North Korean embassy. The issue has been flagged by RUSI, saying that the ambassador in South Africa also travels to a number of neighboring states. The reality as far as South Africa is concerned is, as a result of the 2009 global recession, foreign countries found it was too expensive to maintain embassies throughout the region. So in many cases, they will have an embassy in South Africa and service the neighboring states from South Africa. So it's not unusual to see an ambassador traveling throughout the region because it's a cost-saving exercise. But in terms of our law, although we've ratified the Vienna Convention giving diplomatic immunities to ambassadors and other accredited staff, our laws permit us still to arrest the person if an offence is being committed. It is for the foreign country to then claim diplomatic immunity. We've had instances where the countries have said the person was acting purely for criminal motives and they will not give him immunity, in which case he is prosecuted as an ordinary criminal. But in cases where they do claim immunity, the accreditation is withdrawn and the person is then ordered to leave the country on the first available flight. So I think that briefly wraps up what I was going to contribute to this panel discussion. I'll obviously respond to any questions that are directed. Thank you again.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Chris. That's really, really helpful. And I think you addressed some really key points there, especially that last bit on the diplomats. This is something that we've heard quite a few countries try to grapple with, is how do you walk that line between having North Korean diplomats in country, but also making sure that they're not getting up to anything they shouldn't be. So hopefully we can get to that in the Q&A. Expect we will. I want to now quickly switch actually to Molukin, who, as I mentioned, was having a little bit of technical trouble. So I figure we'll get him to speak before, hopefully we won't lose him, but before we potentially lose him. So Molukin is joining us from Dar es Salaam from Tanzania. And he's the senior legal advisor with the Eastern and Southern Africa Anti-Money Laundering Group, SMLOG, as most of you might know it by. And SMLOG countries were actually the focus of the paper. So we scoped the paper to focus on SMLOG countries specifically. So according to his official title, Molukin is the AML, CFT, and FIU expert at SMLOG, but I know he has a lot of expertise on CPF as well. So I think we could probably add that to his title as well if we wanted to. And he will give a little bit more of a regional perspective on CPF efforts in the SMLOG region. Molukin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Darya. I think since I'm having a slow internet connection problem, you may not able to see me on a video. Will that be okay?
We can't see you, but I think that's all right. We can hear you, which is what matters.
Okay, thanks Darya, and thanks RUSI for inviting us to be able to present our activities in relation to the combating of proliferation financing. As you have rightly mentioned, the purpose of my presentation is just to highlight the work that SMLOG has done to strengthen its regional countering proliferation financing efforts, as well as the way how we are managing ourselves in terms of doing regional cooperation on the subject matter. For those of, I think, for those experts who do not have any information about SMLOG, SMLOG is one of the 9 FATF-style regional bodies who are established to combat money laundering and terrorism financing, as well as proliferation financing. It was established as an FSRB in 1999, and it became one of the associate members of the FATF in 2010. SMLOG, as an associate member of the FATF, it recognizes FATF standards on countering proliferation financing, particularly on recommendation 7, 2, as well as immediate outcome 11, as well as other related recommendations. It also recognizes the relevant international legal instruments, mainly from the UN, including those resolutions on proliferation financing. Based on these standards and legal instruments, what we are actually doing is, it is clearly, as it is clearly stipulated in our MOU, SMLOG is doing a number of activities. The first core activity of SMLOG is doing what we call a peer review process. Under this process, we assess countries to what extent they are complying with the standards, both for technical compliance and effectiveness. And once we have done assessment, we produce mutual evaluation reports. Those mutual evaluation reports, which we normally produce, have aspects of financing. And once the mutual evaluation reports are adopted, we also have what we call a follow-up process, to monitor the progress being made by countries in addressing their identified deficiencies on proliferation financing. And we also look at the regional aspect of, or the regional interest in relation to PF. And then we normally provide technical assistance and training for our members. We normally use our international partners who are regional as well as international intergovernmental institutions and think tanks like RUSI and Center for New American Society. ESABLAG also serves as a platform for exchanging experiences and views. And if it is necessary, we may also work on or carry out typology studies that normally focus on proliferation financing. So to achieve the above goals, we are working with different countries, development partners, international financial institutions like the World Bank and IMF, as well as think tanks like RUSI and the CNAS. Thanks, this is my brief presentation.
Thanks, Malik, and that was really, really helpful. And yes, SMLOG does provide a lot of resources to its members when it comes to typologies and other forms of assistance. So they said the organization is quite familiar, it seems like, with the regional typologies, as well as kind of the challenges and the best practices in the region. Malukan, if you can stick around, we'll pull you in later for the discussion. But in the meantime, let me turn the floor to Lloyd, who, as I mentioned, will give us a little bit more of a private sector perspective on PF and CPF in the region.
Thank you, Darya. I'm going to address my comments from a private sector perspective. I speak from a financial services background, but the scope of the private sector in this area is really quite wide, as the activity mentioned in Darya's paper shows. It involves a whole range of other areas of the private sector, for example, logistics, transportation, shipping and aviation. Now, financial services has touch points with all of these areas, as the related payments would invariably flow through our counters. This is an important topic from private sector perspective. North Korean PF activity in Africa likely represents a very wide-ranging amount of sanctions violations across multiple countries, in many cases concealed through the use of individuals and entities with no overt North Korean affiliation. This represents a challenge to the integrity of the international financial system and presents a risk for non-complicit private sector firms of unwitting breaches of sanctions. So for the private sector, what is PF in Africa and why is it important in addition? Well, from our perspective, the different definition of PF in Africa is better approached, as Darya's paper does, under a broad definition. If you take a narrow definition of PF, such as the FATF example of 2008, then we would be looking solely for the trade in goods or items which could be used for a nuclear or chemical weapons program or related delivery system. This would be quite a challenge for the private sector because identifying WMD components would require some form of specialist knowledge, which few in the banking or transportation sectors would have, and that is even if the goods being proliferated were accurately declared as being what they are. Taking a broader definition of PF to encompass activity which is used to generate funds either for the regime in general or to fund those organisations involved in the development and acquisition of WMD components brings into range almost any activity which we can trace back to North Korea or to those acting on its behalf. From the private sector's perspective, that does make it a lot easier because I imagine few, if any, major companies would want to deal with North Korea, particularly if that could represent a probable sanctions violation and all the potential ramifications that could flow from that. For the private sector, what we're really seeking to address is the risk of sanctions violations. And I would classify PF in this context as being essentially a subset of sanctions restrictions. The reason for that is that if you follow the links up far enough, then you will eventually end up encountering a designated party or sanctioned country at some point. And there are three things which can help the private sector identify the risks of PF. Firstly, a broad understanding of the risks, which papers like Darya's greatly assist us in. Secondly, generalized information around red flags and typologies can be useful. And thirdly, you have specific information regarding actual actors or entities involved in PF. Industry typologies and red flags are useful insofar as understanding the broader risks will assist in defining a company's risk appetite. They can also assist in creating a baseline of understanding that then forms the groundwork for greater information sharing. However, to take action on actual cases of PF working with just a typology or broadly stated red flags on their own is not an effective model in isolation. International and many local banks have in place effective client due diligence, CDD, and an established capability to investigate red flags. These controls can be quite sophisticated, robust, and effective in identifying sanctions concerns. If we want to see effective action on PF, what is required is actionable intelligence or information leads. These can be generated and shared with the private sector through greater cooperation over information sharing. Intelligence leads will then feed into banks' existing control frameworks and enable them to take effective action against such actors who may be seeking to use our products and facilities in order to aid PF-related activity. For effective action against illicit PF actors, we need an intelligence-led, focused approach, and achieving that through public-private information sharing initiatives. Banks can be helpful in developing understanding of the PF networks and facilitators, but this is really only the case when there are actionable targets and intelligence provided. As an example, the information provided by the UN Panel of Experts reports is very useful because they do name names and identify those involved in this activity. A good example of the limitations the private sector faces is in trade finance. Whilst the private sector has access to much information which could lead to potential PF-related activity, often the reality is that banks, in particular, have access to less information than they are perceived to, and trade finance is a good example of this. The frequent perception is that all trade finance involves shipping and product information, which we could use to investigate and identify PF-related activity. However, the reality is that the vast majority of trade finance is done on open account, which greatly reduces a bank's ability to do this. In an open account transaction, the exporter ships the goods to the importer before the payment for the goods is made. Frequently, the terms of the payments are within 90 days, so the ship will literally have sailed within that time, meaning that the ability to investigate and request additional documents is limited, and of course the underlying transaction has already occurred. Whether by default or design, using open account instead of documentary bank intermediated financing will largely avoid the risks for the parties involved of any red flag detection by the bank. And in conclusion, I would just say that PF is a concern for us in the private sector. We are interested in protecting ourselves and the integrity of the wider financial system from the actions of illicit PF actors. Information which can help us understand the risks is useful, but greater cooperation on information sharing and focus leads will enable us to take effective action against it. Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd. That's very helpful, very interesting. It's not, or rather it's something that we hear quite often from the private sector, is the challenges with again getting actionable intelligence, and that information sharing challenge between private and public sector sometimes, and the fact that you can't necessarily rely on just typologies and red flags. Sometimes you actually need actionable information to act on. So on that, why don't we move to a little bit of a discussion. I'll get things rolling by asking our panelists some questions, and then we will open up to a wider Q&A from the audience. We've already had a lot of good questions coming into the Q&A box, so please keep sending them in. And just another reminder, when you do submit a question, if you can just provide your name and your affiliation with it. Again, that just provides us with a little bit of context of who is asking the question. All right, so I actually wanted to follow up on something that Chris, that you mentioned in your remarks, and something that I picked up on at the end, something that we discussed in our paper to some length, and something that I've seen pop up in a couple of Q&As already, is the issue of diplomats, and the role that North Korean diplomats play internationally, not just in Africa, in facilitating North Korean sanctions evasion, PF activities, whether that be through the establishment of companies, of bank accounts through which that money is moved, or in actually engaging themselves in revenue raising and other types of proliferation financing activities. So you did mention that there is, of course, a North Korean embassy in Pretoria with diplomats who appear to be very, very active, including in a couple of neighboring countries. And you did point out that sometimes countries will cross-accredit diplomats. So a diplomat based out of Pretoria might be accredited to other countries. Something that we had a challenge with when we were drafting this paper was actually getting information on cross-accreditation, because that's not always easy to come by. And North Korean diplomats, I would assume to some extent on purpose, don't make that any easier. They try to obfuscate connections and accreditations perhaps. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how do we circumvent that challenge, perhaps when it comes to cooperation between countries in the region, to understand their exposure to PF threats from diplomats specifically, and to address that.
Okay, just briefly, I think the issue is accreditation is linked to a specific country. So a diplomat will arrive in South Africa, present his or her credentials to our government, and on our Department of Foreign Affairs website, we will then publish the list of diplomats who are accredited to our country, but they will not then indicate that they are also accredited to other countries. So one would have to then check each individual country to see where a specific diplomat is accredited. And also, not all countries would actually make that public information. So that makes it difficult to try and track it through looking at formal notifications. I won't put my head in the block, but I believe under the Diplomatic Immunities Convention, there are restrictions on diplomats being involved in trade activities that would be outside the scope of the activities of diplomats, because the protections are there to enable the diplomat to engage in foreign policy related issues. So I could be wrong, but my sense is that a diplomat wouldn't be able to register himself as a director of a company in trade and import, etc. So I think your diplomats, where they are involved in proliferation activities, would be acting clandestinely, so that they'd be involved in activities which are not, easily detected. And perhaps front companies, there may be misuse of the embassy's bank account and diplomatic bag. But I think it would be difficult for a person to be able to remain a diplomat, but being a major business official. In terms of our law as well, if we detect an offence by a diplomat, we're entitled to arrest the person. It's for the country to claim immunity. And also, although immunity is claimed and the person is not prosecuted, we would be entitled, for example, to confiscate and forfeit assets which were involved in that illicit activity. The immunity would not extend to the actual WMD or illicit flows of money. So these are some of the aspects do give you an opportunity to still ensure that diplomats do not become involved in proliferation activities. Obviously, if you wanted to put a stop to it all, the Security Council would have to pass a resolution saying that if a country is subject to sanctions, then the diplomats' immunities are taken away from them. But I think it'd be very difficult to get the Security Council to get the necessary consent to adopt such a resolution. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Something else that I wanted to follow up on, first of all, you are correct as far as I can remember that yes, there are restrictions on diplomats' activities, so they're not able to engage in non-diplomatic activities. One question that I had was, how do you communicate information on diplomats accredited to South Africa to your financial institutions? Do you know if there are mechanisms for making sure that financial institutions are aware, first of all, their obligations when it comes to opening up bank accounts or supporting financial transactions from North Korean diplomats, and that they know who those individuals actually are?
Our point of contact with the financial institutions is our FIU. So they regularly issue advisories to the banks on their obligations, and they have a lot of material on the website which is shared with the banks. we had actually embarked on a program which was interrupted, unfortunately, by COVID-19 to hold workshops with our financial institutions. And that would have been presentations by our FIU, the prosecuting authority, and other law enforcement components with the banks themselves, so they could come to us with their questions, concerns, we could alert them to the relevant issues. And as the previous speaker had emphasized, you know, it's so important that where you can, you do share intelligence with the financial institutions so they know where to look for activities. Just to show you how important that is, just before this webinar started, the police came to me with a file where a South African company sought permission through a bank to remit funds to a company in the British Virgin Islands. And they did due diligence on the company before processing the transaction, which showed that the address given by this company corresponded with a front company for an entity designated by the Security Council as being part of North Korea's missile regime. So the transaction was stopped, and now there's a criminal investigation which we're actually starting now into that company. For what purpose was it remitting their money? Was it just the general movement of funds back into, or was it linked to a WMD procurement? So it does show, you know, how important the financial institutions are to combating proliferation.
Well, there you go, CPF in action. Thanks for that tidbit. That's quite interesting. Lloyd, if I can actually pull you in on that as well. Chris mentioned, you know, the fact that a lot of these diplomats might function clandestinely, which makes sense, again, because they don't want to be tied to the North Korean regime and to supporting North Korean PF. And you talked a little bit about the difficulties of sometimes accessing UBO information. This is something that we addressed in the paper as well. In a lot of these countries, it's hard to actually figure out who's behind a front company, who's behind a shell company. So you did say that, you know, one way of sort of getting around that is to rely on red flags, potentially typologies, but that you do need actionable information a lot of times to be able to do something with that information, to act on it. So can you perhaps go into a little bit more detail on what that looks like in the region, how easy it is to get that actionable information, and where there may be room to improve cooperation between governments and the private sector so that more of this actionable information is generated and shared with the private sector, and perhaps vice versa as well?
Yeah, sure. It's, I mean, there are issues with obviously the sharing of information with different data protection laws, and often we're looking at transactions across borders. So you're looking at not just data protection laws in one country or one jurisdiction rather, but two jurisdictions, and the ability to share information across that, whether information is coming from the public sector, how willing they are to share the information with the private sector, do they have a mechanism with which to do that? And I think there's very much a work in progress there on this area. It's something which is going to vary from country to country, the different stages people have got to with mechanisms to do that. From my perspective, we need a lot more work in this area to build that up, to create those mechanisms so we can share the information. And also from the banking perspective, when we're submitting suspicious activity reports or similar reports, feedback on those reports to let us know when information is useful or if it's actually connected to something of concern is again very useful, so that it provides us some guidance as to the information that we're feeding back. But is it valuable? Have we actually hit on something that's of concern? So I think that two-way feedback between the public and private sector is very important.
Yeah, and I think you'll find that that's a challenge that's not just specific to this region. It's something that we've certainly heard in our work around the world, and I'm sure you know, as you've been familiar with in other parts of the world as well. I did want to actually ask you about the role that Standard Chartered plays and the efforts that you guys have made when it comes to sort of strengthening general financial sector compliance when it comes to sanctions, CPF. So one thing that we highlighted in the paper is the difference in compliance capabilities between financial institutions of different sizes. So a large financial institution probably has more resources, more ability to invest in strengthening CPF efforts, whereas a local institution, like a lot of the banks that operate in Southern and Eastern Africa, they're one country banks, they operate locally, might not have those resources. So I guess I just wanted to see if you can speak a little bit more about what measures Standard Chartered has taken to strengthen sanctions compliance with its correspondent banks, and what efforts you've put into that end.
Yeah, certainly. I think the international banks operating in Africa, so Standard Chartered is a major international bank throughout Africa, plays an important role in terms of the scale and resources that they can bring to bear in enhancing the effective controls of local banks. And this is done in three ways, really. So firstly, by de-risking our correspondent relationships. Secondly, by applying our surveillance and due diligence controls involving these local banks. And thirdly, by raising international standards through recommendations by organizations such as the Wolfsburg Group. By de-risking, I don't necessarily mean exiting banking relationships. I mean, de-risking by exiting banking relationships was a major concern until quite recently. It's something that FATF highlighted in their 2016 guidance on correspondent banking, and it does remain at times a necessary action. However, what we've seen in Standard Chartered is that there is an alternative to this, and that alternative is de-risking through education, whereby Standard Chartered seeks to share industry best practices and thereby promote the local bank's understanding of effective risk management practices and international compliance standards. And we in Standard Chartered have run an effective program in this area for several years now, sharing industry-wide best practices and helping to raise the understanding of compliance effectiveness for our local correspondent banking clients. And this program encompasses access to our training materials and correspondent banking academies, in which we bring together local banks to share best practices, share industry-wide trends, and provide an overview of an effective compliance program. The second means I mentioned was through application of our BAU surveillance controls and ongoing client due diligence involving these banks, which is something which really happens automatically. And this is the case whether it's the local bank is a counterparty or a correspondent. But what we found is for when we're the correspondent bank for these local banks transactions, we're effectively, to an extent, acting as an additional line of control, because those transactions then become subject to our surveillance controls. We don't want the local banks to be reliant on us. They should be, and many are working on and have enhanced their own internal controls. But in practical terms, it's the case that we're functioning as an additional line of control for our respondent clients. So I think international banks have a twofold impact on local banks here, sharing industry best practices to raise their understanding and effectiveness of compliance controls and acting as a de facto additional line of control. And finally, in addition, there's been a lot of ongoing work to define what good international regulatory standards and best practices are. For example, in the Wolfsburg Group Correspondent Banking Due Diligence Questionnaire. In addition, there is work looking at agreeing a reasonable level of assurance and building the knowledge and capabilities of respondent banks so that we can raise their standards to what we and other international banks would expect them to be.
Thanks, Lloyd. That's helpful. And I guess just a last follow-up on that is, how do you think governments in the region, or broadly really, how do you think governments can tap into a lot of the work that you have outlined that Standard Chartered banks, that I'm sure a lot of other larger international banks are doing, to again strengthen CPF compliance within their own countries or within their own regions? What is that cooperation, I guess, what would that look like?
Yeah, so firstly, through our own engagement with our regulators, we can demonstrate to them the robustness and effectiveness of our controls, and then the expectations that we have in turn with our counterparty or respondent banks of their compliance controls. And secondly, through outreach activities to improve information sharing, as I mentioned earlier about different data privacy regulations, mean that this does present a challenge. But I think that overall there's much more that we can do in this area to enhance the ability to share information between public and private sector, between government agencies internationally.
Thanks, Lloyd. Lots of work to do.
Yeah.
Lots of work to do, clearly. And actually on that point, this is something that we consistently grapple with, what we had to grapple with for the paper is, you know, this is, yes, there's some low-hanging fruit. There's some fairly easy things that can be done here and there to strengthen CPF efforts. But at the end of the day, it does require input, and it does require resources, and does require work. And a lot of the countries in the region and elsewhere, frankly, they just have so much other things on their plate, so much more that they have to take care of that's on their plates, whether it be, again, weak economies that need strengthening, or other forms of crime like corruption, COVID at the moment. There's plenty of other challenges, and something we had to figure out is, you know, how do we communicate the importance of strengthening CPF regimes across the region to governments, and investing those resources. And it's challenging sometimes because, like I said, there are other priorities vying for those resources. And one thing we found is that a lot of the recommendations that we provided, and a lot of the other measures that can be taken, apply kind of across financial crime or organized crime generally, and address those threats as well. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. But I wanted to bring in Molukin to see if he might be able to provide some input on that as well. Molukin, are you still with us? Can you hear me?
Yes, Darya, I am hearing you.
Lovely, perfect. So I guess I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about, considering all of the challenges that exist in the region, how do you, as a regional organization that understands the importance of CPF efforts, how do you communicate that importance to regional governments, and how do you make sure that CPF doesn't get lost in the whole other laundry list of challenges that need to be addressed in the region? How do you highlight the importance of CPF efforts?
Sure, Darya. I think one of the purposes of SAMLAG under its MOU is to serve as, you know, a sort of platform for our member jurisdictions on matters in relation to the combating of money laundering and terrorism financing, as well as proliferation financing. Actually, all our 18 members, they have signed the SAMLAG MOU to implement all the 40 FATF recommendations. And among the FATF recommendations, there are issues in relation to proliferation financing, especially if you can have a look at recommendation 2, recommendation 7, and immediate outcome 11. All of these standards, they are in relation to combating of proliferation financing. So we normally do two things for achieving the purpose in relation to proliferation financing. One, we assess countries. So when we assess countries, we see to what extent they have a legal coverage for implementing the relevant UN Security Council resolutions in relation to PF. And we also see to what extent they have entrenched a sort of effective system in taking the necessary targeted financial sanction measures against the listed individuals and entities. Once we identify the core deficiencies during the course of assessment, we produce a mutual evaluation report. And once that mutual evaluation report is adopted, it will serve as a follow-up, a follow-up mechanism in monitoring the progress of jurisdictions in addressing the identified deficiencies against their respective mutual evaluation reports. And if any jurisdiction is not in a position to show a sufficient progress once the assessment is done and once a given period is elapsed, we also have some other measures which we can take at a SAMLAG level. This measure may include, in terms of first we send them a letter for showing that they are making slow progress in addressing the identified deficiencies. And then we give them also a timeline or a period. Once that period lapses, if we see that the slow progress is still there, we may undertake a high-level mission. And based on the high-level mission, we give them also actions to be taken, you know, as a sort of short term and both long term or medium term. And if they're not in a position to implement still those action items, we can also issue a public statement at a SAMLAG level. We may also refer the matter to the FATF so that they can also take measures, you know, by putting them on a public statement as part of their monitoring jurisdiction, or you know, as part of countries which the FATF can take as a sort of countermeasure by its member as well as the global network. That is how we normally do it. So we assess, we follow up, and we take also action. By doing this kind of activities, we believe that we can encourage our members to implement the relevant recommendations in relation to proliferation financing. And in addition to that, we also give technical assistance and training for our members when they are formulating their laws. For example, we currently have 5 jurisdictions who have got legal framework in relation to PF. Those countries may include Namibia, Malawi, Ethiopia, and Mauritius, and also South Africa. So we ask those countries to assess other member jurisdictions who still do not have the sufficient legal framework in dealing with proliferation financing. So we also partner with international organizations and think tanks, you know, for organizing workshops, for outreaching both the public and the private sector, as well as we provide trainings in collaboration with institutions like the FATF train. So, you know, we do all these activities on money laundering, terrorism financing, as well as proliferation financing. So we still remember them. And then, I mean, as a part of practical example, you can mention, for example, the case of Botswana, Mauritius, and Zimbabwe, which are now on the FATF public statement. And one of the action items which they are supposed to address in consultation with the FATF ICRG is on matters in relation to proliferation financing.
Thanks, Mugen, that's helpful. And I think it is an important point to make that, you know, it's in the very extreme, and it does tend to be in the very extreme when countries don't implement proper CPF, AML, TFC, or CFT, sorry, measures, they can end up on the FATF grey list, and that has, of course, an important reputational implication for economies, which at the end of the day, if you're dealing with a struggling economy, and if that's a concern, then that's also a consideration to take. What I want to do now actually is to switch over to audience questions. There's some really good ones coming in, which I think tie in nicely with the conversation that we've already been having. So I have one question here from Rashid Ahmini from the Office of DPP in Mauritius. And he's pointing out that many jurisdictions within SMLOG, the legislative framework exists to deal with PF and with financial crimes in general, but the difficulty comes with effective implementation of this legislation owing to different factors. And again, this is something that we found in the paper as well, that a lot of times the legislation's there, but how do you enforce it? How do you monitor compliance with that legislation? So he's wanting to know, you know, what measures have countries been taking to address this problem with effective implementation to achieve objectives. So I know perhaps Molukin, you might have some thoughts on this. Chris, as a prosecutor yourself, you might have some opinions as well. Lloyd, perhaps from the private sector, whoever wants to jump in, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Rash, for that question. I think it is a very valid question, valid point to be discussed around this room. Generally, what I could say is, you know, it starts from taking, you know, legislative measures. Actually, it's not the majority of Islamic countries which are having a legal framework on PF. As I have said before, it's only 5 of our member jurisdictions among the 18 jurisdictions which have got a legal framework in relation to PF. After having the enabling legal framework, what countries can do is, first, I think they should designate institutions from the government side, institution which can monitor what is happening throughout the whole world in relation to PF. That institution should be designated to check regularly what is on the UN sanctions list, and within a matter of hours, I mean within 24 hours, that designated institution should circulate the listed individuals and entities to the relevant public and private institutions. And I think when we assess countries, we have also found that as a matter of AML safety supervision scope, the issue on proliferation financing was not covered very well. So as a matter of controlling mechanism, the supervisory authorities should also play their own role once the list is circulated, to monitor the reporting institutions under their purview to check to what extent they are listing the check and to what extent they are also checking a positive match so that they can report to the relevant institution within the given period. As you may know, the standard on PF is not a risk-based, but it is a rule-based. What it means is, though there is still a challenge in applying risk-based supervision, when you come to the issue on PF, it is a rule-based. So it is not difficult as such, to check which institutions are properly implementing their obligations out of it. And as a part of your supervision, you should sensitize them, you should outreach them, you should also have a sort of regular dialogue with them. And once you have done all these activities, if there is no any progress from the side of the private sector, you may start taking some administrative as well as criminal measures. And of course, as Darya was saying, there are some external factors which may really affect the overall structural element, including corruption. So those kind of activities should not in any way hamper, exercising powers in relation to the combating of proliferation financing. So, it requires a sort of legislative measure, institutional measure, as well as supervision measure, and taking action, both administrative, civil, and criminal action, by imposing what we call a wide range of sanctions according to the FATF standard.
Great, thanks, Malik, and that's really helpful. And the importance of designating a single institution or single agency who knows that is their responsibility to monitor CPF obligations, monitor compliance. We highlighted that as well, and I think you hit on a really important point there to make sure that an agency knows they're responsible for that it's their responsibility and that it sits with them. I wanted to flip that same question actually to Chris. Again, as a prosecutor, you might have some experience with this and some challenges and some best practices. And then if I can at the same time, so that you can answer it together, I did want to point you another question, which I thought was quite a good one. And it's from Ian McDonald. Are there any indications or information concerning the interaction between Chinese and DPRK or North Korean individuals in the region? For example, North Korean businesses and or personnel masquerading as Chinese nationals. This is something that we briefly mentioned in the paper, but I'm wondering if you had some more input on that. So I'll leave those two questions with you.
Hi, thank you. Can I come in now? I would like to highlight what the previous speaker had said on you've passed laws, but how do you enforce them? There is no shortcut. You have to have dedicated components that are properly trained, familiar with what has to be enforced to work on these matters. But then obviously when you're looking at our regions, there are cost restraints So it would be impossible to have specialized capability to cover each and every eventuality. So in our case, we say it's critically important to do a risk assessment and then to align your priorities according to risk. For example, if a country does not have a WMD industry, it's inherently unlikely that there'd be an attempt to source materials from it. So you wouldn't put your focus then on trying to ring fence a non-existent industry, but it may well be that Korea would want to come in and say, we can do cheap construction work, and that would be the risk. So that would be the focus on which companies are actually coming into your territory, even though they're doing ordinary commercial trade, are they not connected to North Korea? So that would be the focus. What we also find is critical, because with South Africa, we do have a WMD industry. At the same time, we're part of the international financial sector, so there's a lot of cross-border commercial activity. So we have, dedicated structures covering the field, but it's important that all these activities are coordinated at the right level, so you can see the connections between commercial proliferation activity and perhaps WMD activity. So we put a lot of score on coordination, where we have interdepartmental working groups to cross-pollinate. So we need to reach out to the right people through the right channel. But we also find having a healthy interaction with the Security Council panels, because we work closely with them. They're very helpful. We can exchange information. They've had a couple of times paid country visits to us, which have been helpful. We've updated them on our situation. They've shared lots of info to us. So that comes into the equation. The reports which the North Korean and the Iranian Security Councils publish are very useful, because they will identify shipping companies that are involved in proliferation, front companies, how military commodities are sold disguised as excavation equipment, etc., etc. So that's also useful to take that information into account. Just on the last question, we haven't had experiences of North Koreans pretending to be Chinese officials. As far as China is concerned, South Africa and China are part of a multilateral organization with Brazil and the Russian Federation. So we have very close, ties with China, cooperation between our immigration department and their immigration department. So Chinese people coming into the country, have to have the right documentation. If there are any question marks, we could immediately approach our Chinese counterparts in the country to verify it. But what we have found on the transshipment cases is that most of the goods originate from China, being the closest port to North Korea. So we've had examples of components of a T-54 battle tank in a container consigned by a Chinese company which manufactures wooden handles or so. So we picked that up, and that's also reflected in the Security Council report. So that's basically what I'd like to say on the two questions.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Yeah, and transshipment is something that we looked at as well, right? That a lot of times North Korea or other proliferators will ship through a country, a third country, before actually shipping goods onto North Korea. So it's important to make sure that gaps are closed there. So I should point out there was a comment that came in here from Leonie Dunn, who I mentioned was unable to join us on video today and on the panel, but she is the director of the Financial Intelligence Center in Namibia, and she had pointed out that Namibia has done extensive preventative assessments and audits to assess whether regulated entities in the country have actually been implementing measures. This is to go to the earlier point on, how do you make sure that there is compliance, and how do you monitor compliance basically of CPF measures. So they've done risk assessments and audits of the regulated agencies to make sure that they're actually complying and to identify gaps. And the outcome resulted in non-compliance being referred for active investigations by law enforcement, as well as for administrative penalties to be imposed by non-compliant institutions. institutions. So again, another approach to that. Namibia is one of the very few countries in the world that has actually done a national PF risk assessment. Again, I could probably count them on the fingers of maybe not one, but definitely two hands, the countries who've done national PF risk assessments, but really a critical instrument as well to understanding PF risk exposure. Moving on to a different question, and this one I'd like to direct to Lloyd, and the question comes from Chris Grout, and it's relating to the private sector specifically. So he asks, for the private sector, what is the most effective method of sharing information about risk, typologies, and specific information about entities engaged in sanctions evasion? Is it international conference presentations, for instance, through organizations like ACAMS? Is it through regional engagement, through sector engagement? So Chris, Lloyd, if you could grab that one, that'd be interesting to hear from you on.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I mean, I think it really depends on the circumstances with those. If we're talking about general situations that we've encountered, then that's the type of information we might be able to share at forums like such as RUSI or international conferences. If it's something more specific where it's relating to information that's come to us through transactions from a client or a counterparty, then we're into the realm of sort of data privacy, and that type, it really restricts our ability to share that information. So in that type of scenario, I think it would really be submitting a suspicious activity report or similar to the local authorities. That would be the mechanism by which we could share that information if something we were aware there was illicit activity taking place, either confirmed or suspected. That would be the route we would have to take. So very, very dependent on the situation.
Great, thanks. I see there's a couple of questions here. I think on the diplomats, hopefully we've covered that a bit, and that was helpful. By the way, if anybody has any outstanding questions that are pressing that they feel we don't answer in this session, please do feel free to ping myself or anyone on the RUSI team on our emails, or contact CFCS directly. We'll leave the contact details at the end of this, and we'll make sure that, well, we'll do our best to answer any pressing questions that we don't get to. There is a question here though on, and this one perhaps could go to, actually I don't know who would be best placed to this, so I'll throw it out to everyone and see if anybody has any opinions, perhaps to Chris. I know there's some cooperation within South Africa between kind of different industries that are open to proliferation risk. There's a question from Anu Mathur Boyd, and she's interested to hear about an understanding of and approaches to PF controls within the manufacturing sector or the private sector other than banks. So Chris, I know that South Africa has a council that brings together quite a few different agencies that deal with not just the financial sector, but other sectors that are open to proliferation threats. So how is that information shared? And critically, how is information on proliferation finance shared with those entities? Because as far as I understand, financial regulators are actually not part of that council. So how is information on PF shared with those entities that are, again, outside the financial sector, so manufacturing, et cetera, but that might still be open to PF risk?
Certainly. If we look at your sanctions on North Korea, the most important are obviously the military and the WMD sanctions. So with South Africa, we are part of the Wassenaar arrangement, which regulates military commodities. And under our Department of Defense, we have a control body which regulates all military trade, and all entities wishing to trade must be registered, which requires a stringent vetting process to see that that entity is not connected to any proliferant state or other undesirable, entity. Then each and every transaction is regulated. So the company is registered, but it wants to do a individual import or export. Authorization has to be obtained, and again, there's scrutiny. We even extend it to covering freight forwarders, shipping agents, and brokers. So even the shipping company that's appointed to transfer the goods itself must be registered and be authorized to convey the goods. As I indicated, we also cover transshipments. Brokers as well, even if they are from South Africa facilitating a deal between the UAE and, say, Brazil, they require authorization from our authority. Then we move to the trigger list items, which are items that are directly linked to nuclear weapons production. They are under our nuclear energy department. Because there we need the specialized expertise to identify these items and see that people do not move controlled items under false declarations. But they have the same stringent regime as with the military controls. Also, when you're dealing with trigger list items, you need IAE approval to transfer technology. So any trigger list item leaving our country has to be approved by IAEA. They even have the power to come and have their inspectors seal the item before it leaves and accompany the ship or aircraft if they regard it as a vulnerable commodity. That then takes us to nuclear dual-use items, chemical and biological controls, and also our missile technology regime. Those fall under our Non-Proliferation Council. Again, a very stringent regime. And then the three bodies talk to each other, and we have dedicated prosecutors, dedicated investigators who work with those bodies to investigate violations. Through the FIC, we will then take those matters to our financial institutions. Because when we deal with the industry, our control bodies screen against all the consolidated UN lists. So there'll be a check, is the person registered? But now when the person wants to do an export, which will obviously involve money coming into the country, then that'll go to the financial sector. They will again independently screen on the same lists. And then through the FIU, they will pick up transactions which are suspicious. But what we do in our work, as soon as we pick a violation, we'll go to the FIU and task them specifically to contact the banks and see if they have any matching finances which will link to that transaction. And in our proliferation cases, we've got a lot of key evidence through the financial institutions. What we find is with proliferation, often the item will be underdeclared, not only to avoid paying high import duties, but also not to alert suspicion, because if it's a highly valued item, customs might want to put more scrutiny on it. But then if the item is lost at sea, the client would want his money back. So with the bank, you've got actual insurance documents which show the true value. And the true value will make it more likely to be a controlled item than a non-controlled item. Also with letters of credit, you know, the client sitting out the country, he can't come in for fear of being arrested. So he wants to ensure that he's not being defrauded. So again, he will, through the bank, want proof of what he's getting before he actually releases the money. And again, there would be the clues that it would prove that it's a controlled item and not an ordinary commercial item. So those are, you know, the checks and balances that we do have in the industry. And this is how we bring the financial sector into it. As I indicated, we want to aggressively have workshops with our finance to increase, you know, the understanding of the matters and to encourage self-reporting and more enhanced due diligence.
Perfect, thanks, Chris. That's very helpful. We have a question here that I think is quite interesting from Aaron Arnold, who actually sits on the UN Panel of Experts committee, which produces the excellent reports that we've referenced several times now, and which are really an excellent resource for anybody doing any work on proliferation finance, whether it's within government or financial institutions. And Aaron is asking, what are the most or least relevant, sorry, let me just, what are the most and least relevant aspects of the POE reports? So which ones are most helpful or least helpful from an industry perspective? So Lloyd, if you want to grab that one.
Yeah, it's, I mean, overall, I find it very useful for us in giving us a very detailed oversight of latest information on North Korean illicit PF activity and providing lots of useful leads which we can then follow up and and investigate from our side to see if we have any connections there. I'd say the thing that I would really like to see improved on it is perhaps the format, I think, of PDF documents. If there was an Excel spreadsheet of all the names that were contained in the document, it would make our lives a lot easier. I think that's the main improvement I would request from these reports.
Great, thank you. Yes, and someone who's had to dig through quite a few of the PDF file, or rather the, well, scan.
They're very lengthy, which is good. But
they are very lengthy. There's a lot of information in there. But yes, perhaps a little bit more of a searchable annex would be helpful, but a great resource, as I said, once again, for anyone working on PF. Thanks, Lloyd, that's very helpful. A quick question here that I just came across, if I can find it again, and I think it'll probably be our last one. And this question is from, if I can find it, there's a lot of questions coming in, so I'm having a little bit of trouble keeping track, but it's from Stefan Blanky from Brussels. He's a freelancer for Jane's Intelligence and Intelligence Online. And he's asking about cooperation of DPRK with organized crime more broadly in Africa. So facilitating, smuggling, etc. And again, this is something that perhaps ties into sort of the more, I guess you would call them traditional organized crime activities. So how does North Korea interact with more traditional sort of organized groups in the region, organized crime, criminal groups in the region? And then if I can tag a question on to that, how are countries and how is the region as a whole addressing CPF within the sort of larger organized crime context, I guess, and what is the intersection between efforts to counter organized crime and CPF, because especially in the North Korean case, there is a bit of intersection there, as we've seen. So perhaps if I can start with Molukin on that one. Molukin, can you hear us? And can you unmute yourself if you're muted?
Sorry, Darya, it was a bit interrupted. Can you repeat it, please?
Yeah, so the question is on what interaction have you seen between North Korea, North Korean PF, and organized crime in the region? And then my question on top of that was, what is the intersection of the efforts to counter broader organized crime and PF in the region?
Well, yeah, I think it is a tricky one. During the course of our assessments, in fact, we haven't yet identified any information in relation to the link between organized crimes and PF-related activities. But generally, what I can say is we have found in one of our jurisdictions that some illegal fishing business was being done, and those individuals who were doing that business, most of them, they were on the UN sanctions list. So, you know, when they were normally committing a sort of organized crime in relation to illegal fishing business, we have found that the individuals on the list were also participating. But at this stage, I am afraid to answer it in a comprehensive manner because we don't have yet any information yet.
Thanks, Molukin. That's helpful. That's why I pinged it to you, because it was a challenging question. Maybe you could answer. Chris or Lloyd, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. All right, not hearing. Oh, Chris.
Hi, we haven't picked up any links between organized crime syndicates and North Korea at the moment. I don't know if you heard, we haven't picked up links between organized crime and North Korea at the moment. So we have dedicated components that do work on organized crime matters, and they've detected certain activities, for example, with foreign countries looking at environmental, offences, narcotics, etc. But we haven't linked North Korea to any of that activity.
Thanks, Chris. I guess that is a positive note to end on. I don't know, but it is an interesting question, though, nevertheless, because we do see North Korea engaging in organized crime-like activities or activities that other forms of organized crime tend to engage in. But it is interesting to hear that you've not actually seen the interaction between organized crime and North Korean actors. So on that, I will end our webinar there. I thought it was a very interesting discussion. I hope you did as well. Again, if there are any questions that we didn't get to, there were quite a few coming in, a lot of really good questions. If there's anything that's very pressing that you want us to address, please do feel free to flip it to us. The link to our CPF webpage is on the screen right now. You'll find all of our contact information there. Well, mine, not the panelists, but I'm sure they'll be happy for me to forward questions to them if there's anything that pertains to them specifically. On the screen, you'll see also our other work that we've done on PF. So guidance for financial institutions. We have a model law that Anagha, Joshi, the co-author of this paper, had also authored. We've got our guide to conducting a national PF risk assessment, as well as information on crypto and North Korean use of crypto. There were some questions in our question Q&A as well on that. So some of you might find that publication interesting. And then as well, a report on the role of the insurance industry in CPF. So hopefully if you have any questions on PF, we've got you covered. If not, please do feel free to reach out. And thanks once again for joining. Again, hope everyone's doing well and hope that you will join us for our future webinars. Thank you.